Put up electric gates after Karen keeps trespassing on my private road. Have you ever had that moment when you realize your dream home might become your worst nightmare? Well, buckle up, because this story about privacy, property rights, and one very persistent trespasser will show you exactly how I turned the tables on a neighborhood Karen who thought my private road was her personal shortcut. Hey everyone, before we dive into this wild ride, make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. Trust me, you won't want to miss what's coming next on this channel. Now let's get into it. I never thought I'd be the type of person to install electric gates on my property, but life has a funny way of pushing you to extremes. It all started last spring when my partner David and I finally achieved our dream of owning a beautiful piece of land just outside the city limits. Picture this, 5 acres of pristine property with mature oak trees, a winding private road leading to a charming craftsman-style house, and enough space for me to finally set up my dream photography studio. The property was everything we'd been saving for over the past decade. The previous owners had maintained it meticulously, and the private road that curved through the woods to our house gave us that perfect sense of seclusion while still being just 10 minutes from downtown. As a professional photographer who works from home, this setup was perfect for my business. The natural lighting, the peaceful atmosphere, and the privacy for my clients. It all seemed meant to be. The first few weeks were absolutely magical. David would leave for his IT job in the morning, taking the scenic private road out to the main street, and I'd spend my days either shooting in my new home studio or editing photos on our wraparound porch, listening to birds and enjoying the serenity. Our nearest neighbors, the Thompsons, were lovely people who respected boundaries and even brought us a homemade apple pie as a welcome gift. Sarah Thompson in particular quickly became a good friend. She warned me that while most people in the area were wonderful, there was one neighbor who had a reputation for being difficult. "Just keep an eye out for Barbara Wilson," she'd said, trying to sound casual, but with an undertone of concern that I should have paid more attention to. She tends to think rules don't apply to her. I remember laughing it off at the time. After all, our property was clearly marked with private road and no trespassing signs at the entrance. Who would possibly think they could just use someone else's private drive as their personal thoroughfare? Oh, how naive I was. The first time I noticed something was off was during a client photo shoot. I was capturing family portraits for the Johnsons, a lovely couple with twin toddlers, when I heard the distinct sound of tires on gravel. At first, I assumed it was another client arriving early, but when I looked down the road, I saw an unfamiliar blue SUV cruising down our private drive like it belonged there. I excused myself from the shoot and walked toward the vehicle, waving to get the driver's attention. The SUV slowed to a stop, and the window rolled down to reveal a woman in her 50s with perfectly coiffed blonde hair and an expression that suggested I was the one inconveniencing her. "Can I help you?" I asked, trying to keep my tone friendly, despite the obvious trespassing. "Oh, I'm just taking the shortcut to the Thompson place," she replied with a dismissive wave. "Been doing it for years." That's when I met Barbara Wilson for the first time, though I didn't know then how much this seemingly minor interaction would escalate. "I'm sorry, but this is actually a private road," I explained. "The signs at the entrance clearly state—" "Listen, honey," she cut me off, her saccharine smile not quite reaching her eyes. "I've lived in this area for 20 years. This road cuts 10 minutes off my drive to the shops, and Nancy, the previous owner, never had a problem with it." Before I could respond that Nancy's preferences didn't change the legal status of the road, Barbara had already rolled up her window and continued driving through my property, leaving me standing there in disbelief as my clients watched the whole scene unfold. That evening, when David got home, I told him about the incident. He suggested we should probably document any future encounters, just in case. "Better safe than sorry," he said, pulling up security camera options on his laptop. Little did we know how prophetic those words would turn out to be. After my first encounter with Barbara Wilson, I decided to take a proactive approach. David helped me install security cameras at both ends of our private road, and I started keeping a detailed log of every unauthorized vehicle that came through. What I discovered was shocking. Barbara wasn't just using our road occasionally. She was driving through multiple times a day, often with different friends in her car, like she was giving tours of our property. The final straw came during an important client session. I was photographing an outdoor wedding when Barbara's blue SUV came barreling down the drive, kicking up dust and ruining what would have been perfect shots of the bride and groom's first look. The bride was in tears, and I had to reschedule the entire shoot, costing me not only money, but also my professional reputation. That evening, I decided to have a civilized conversation with Barbara. I drove to her house, which was actually on the main road, making her shortcuts through our property even more ridiculous. When she opened her door, she had that same condescending smile plastered on her face. "Mrs. Wilson," I started, keeping my voice level, "I need to talk to you about using our private road. Today you disrupted a wedding photo shoot, and I lost a client because of it." Barbara's smile didn't waver. "Oh dear, was that your event? I thought it was just some people taking pictures. You really should post signs if you're going to have activities on the road." I took a deep breath, reminding myself to stay professional. We do have signs, both about it being a private road and about the photo session today. The thing is, you're not supposed to be using the road at all. It's private property. "Well," she said, crossing her arms, "I've already told you that." Nancy never had an issue with it, and frankly, I don't see why you're being so difficult about this. It's just a road. "It's not just a road," I explained. "It's my property, my business location, and my liability if anything happens. I'm asking you nicely to please stop using it." Barbara's fake smile finally dropped. "Listen here," she snapped. "I'm not some outsider you can boss around. I'm on the town council, and I've lived here long enough to know how things work. That road is the most convenient route to the shopping center, and I'm not going to add 10 minutes to my drive just because some newcomer wants to play gatekeeper." Before I could respond, her husband Richard appeared behind her. "Is there a problem here?" he asked, his tone carrying a subtle threat. "Your wife is repeatedly trespassing on our private road," I stated firmly. "I'm requesting that she stop." Richard stepped forward. "Barbara told me about your concerns. Perhaps we could come to an arrangement." The previous owner understood the value of being neighborly. "There's no arrangement to be made," I replied. "It's private property. Please respect that." As I turned to leave, I heard Barbara call out, "You'll regret being so unreasonable about this." The next morning, I discovered exactly what kind of unreasonable consequences Barbara had in mind. Our private road signs had been torn down, and in their place were crude handwritten signs reading "Public Access" and "Community Shortcut." The security cameras had caught everything. Barbara and Richard putting up the fake signs in the middle of the night, looking smugly satisfied with themselves. I immediately called the police. Officer Mike Reynolds arrived within the hour, and I showed him the security footage. He seemed troubled by the escalation, but tried to play it down. "Look," he said, reviewing the footage, "I understand this is frustrating, but these situations can get out of hand quickly. Are you sure you want to press charges? Mrs. Wilson is on the town council, and things could get complicated." "Officer Reynolds," I replied, "are you telling me that her position means she's above the law?" He shifted uncomfortably. "No, of course not. But maybe we could try talking to them first. Sometimes these neighborhood disputes—" "This isn't a dispute," I interrupted. "This is deliberate vandalism and harassment. I have it on video, and I want to file a report. Reluctantly, Officer Reynolds took my statement and documented the vandalism. As he was leaving, he paused. "Just be careful. The Wilsons have a lot of influence in this town." That warning should have prepared me for what came next, but nothing could have really readied me for Barbara's next move. The following day, while reviewing the security footage from overnight, I watched in disbelief as a parade of cars drove down our road. At least 20 vehicles, one after another, headlights cutting through the darkness. Leading the convoy was Barbara's blue SUV, like some twisted tour guide showing her friends the path. The footage showed them stopping in front of our house, car horns blaring for almost 10 minutes straight. It was a deliberate message. If I wouldn't let Barbara use the road quietly, she'd make sure everyone used it loudly. I spent the next morning making calls to lawyers, to the county clerk's office, to anyone who might be able to help.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
The property deed clearly showed the road was private, and our liability insurance agent was horrified when I told him about the unauthorized traffic. He made it clear that if anyone got hurt on our road, we could be sued, regardless of whether they were there legally or not. That's when I knew I needed to take more serious measures. If signs and security cameras weren't enough to deter Barbara and her followers, maybe it was time to create a more substantial barrier. I contacted James Cooper, a local security expert, to discuss options for installing electric gates. As James walked the property, measuring and taking notes, Barbara's SUV appeared right on schedule. She rolled to a stop, her expression darkening, as she realized what we were doing. "You can't put up gates," she shouted through her window. "This road has been open for decades." James turned to her, his professional demeanor unwavering. "Ma'am, this is a private road on private property. The owners have every right to secure their property as they see fit." Barbara's face turned red. "We'll see about that," she snarled before speeding off, gravel spraying from her tires. "You're going to want cameras on these gates," James advised, watching her car disappear around the bend. "Something tells me this isn't over." He wasn't wrong. Barbara Wilson was about to prove just how far she'd go to get her way, and I was about to learn exactly why Sarah Thompson had tried to warn me about her in the first place. The morning James Cooper and his team began installing the electric gates, I noticed an unusual amount of activity in the neighborhood. Cars kept driving by slowly, their occupants taking photos of our property. My phone was buzzing with text messages from unknown numbers, all carrying the same theme: "Don't do this to our community." I blocked each number, but they kept coming. Sarah Thompson stopped by with her usual morning coffee, her face etched with concern. "Emily, you need to know what Barbara's been saying around town," she said, settling into a chair on my porch. "She's telling everyone you're trying to cut off emergency vehicle access to the whole neighborhood. She's got people really worked up about it." I nearly choked on my coffee. "That's ridiculous. The gates will have an emergency access code, and we're installing a separate keypad specifically for first responders. James is coordinating everything with the fire department and emergency services." Sarah nodded sympathetically. "I know that, but Barbara's got half the town convinced you're some sort of evil developer trying to shut down historical access routes." She paused, twirling her coffee cup nervously. "There's going to be a town council meeting tonight. Barbara's put your gates on the agenda." I spent the afternoon gathering documentation, property surveys, deed records, liability insurance papers, and photos of Barbara's trespassing and vandalism. David came home early from work to attend the meeting with me. As we walked into the town hall, the tension was palpable. Barbara sat at the council table, wearing what I'd come to think of as her battle smile. The meeting room was packed with people standing along the walls. I recognized many faces from Barbara's midnight convoy. She had certainly rallied her troops. When the gates issue came up on the agenda, Barbara stood, straightening her blazer with practiced authority. Fellow citizens, she began, her voice dripping with false concern. We're facing a serious threat to our community's welfare. The Andersons are attempting to install gates on Oakwood Drive, a road that has served as a vital connection for our neighborhood for generations. I stood up, ready to correct her, but she spoke over me. This isn't just about convenience. This is about safety, about children being able to get to school, about emergency vehicles reaching our homes, about maintaining the character of our historic neighborhood. The crowd murmured in agreement. Barbara was playing to her audience masterfully. When she finished her speech, several of her supporters stood to share emotional stories about using the community road over the years. None of them mentioned that it was private property or that their shortcuts were technically trespassing. Finally, it was my turn to speak. I walked to the podium, laying out my documents. First, I need to correct several misstatements. I began. The road in question is not Oakwood Drive, that's 2 streets over. This is a private road on private property, as clearly shown in these property records. I held up the surveys. It has never been a public road or a community access point. The room grew quieter as I continued. We're installing gates because of ongoing trespassing and harassment documented here. I played a short clip from our security cameras showing Barbara's midnight convoy and the vandalism of our signs. The gates will have emergency access codes, which have already been coordinated with all emergency services. I have the documentation right here. Barbara's face had turned an interesting shade of red. That footage is taken out of context, she interrupted. We were having a neighborhood celebration. At midnight, on our private property, without permission, I countered. Would you like me to play the audio of the horn honking too? Richard Wilson stood up from the audience. Now see here, he blustered. You can't just move into a neighborhood and start changing everything. There are traditions to consider. Then trespassing isn't a tradition, Mr. Wilson, I replied firmly. It's a crime, and so is vandalism. The council president, an elderly gentleman named Frank Martinez, who had been watching the exchange with growing concern, finally spoke up. Mrs. Wilson, did you organize that late night celebration on the Andersons' property? Barbara's smile faltered slightly. It was just a neighborhood get-together. We've always used that road. Without permission, I added, and after being explicitly told to stop. Frank Martinez shuffled through some papers. I have here a letter from the fire department confirming they've approved the gate design and emergency access protocols. He looked at Barbara over his glasses. It seems the safety concerns have been thoroughly addressed. But the historical access, Barbara began, is not supported by any official records, Frank interrupted. I've reviewed the documentation. The road is privately owned, has always been privately owned, and the owners have every right to secure their property. The mood in the room began to shift. I could see people whispering, some looking at Barbara with new eyes. Her tradition argument was crumbling in the face of actual facts. Then Sarah Thompson stood up. I hadn't expected her to speak, and from Barbara's expression neither. Had she? I've lived here for 15 years, Sarah began, and I think it's time someone said this publicly. Barbara, you've been bullying people about that road for years. You harassed the previous owners too, until they were too tired to fight back. Everyone's been too afraid of your influence to stand up to you, but enough is enough. Barbara's facade cracked. How dare you? I've done nothing but look out for this community's interests. By trespassing? By organizing midnight harassment campaigns? By vandalizing private property? Sarah countered. That security footage shows who's really disrupting our community, and it isn't the Andersons. The council voted unanimously to acknowledge our right to install the gates. As people filed out of the meeting, I noticed several of Barbara's former supporters avoiding her gaze. Her power over the community was built on bluster and intimidation, and both were failing her now. but I knew better than to think this was over. As Barbara brushed past me, she whispered, "You have no idea what you've started." She was right about one thing. It wasn't over. But what happened next would shock even those who thought they knew exactly what Barbara Wilson was capable of. The installation of the electric gates progressed quickly over the next few days. James Cooper's team worked efficiently, setting up the sleek black barriers that would finally secure our property. They installed keypads on both sides, emergency, access protocols, and additional security cameras to monitor the entire setup. Everything was going smoothly, too smoothly, as it turned out. 3 days after the town council meeting, I was editing photos in my home studio when David called from work. "Emily, you need to check the security cameras right now," he said, his voice tense. "I just got an alert on my phone." I pulled up the camera feed on my computer and felt my stomach drop. A construction crew was at our front gate, complete with a small excavator. Barbara Wilson stood nearby, gesturing animatedly while talking. To someone who appeared to be the crew foreman, I grabbed my keys and rushed outside. As I approached, I could hear Barbara's voice, dripping with artificial sweetness. "Yes, right through here. The utility easement gives you full access. Don't mind the gates, they're not properly permitted anyway." "Excuse me," I called out, pulling out my phone to record. "What exactly do you think you're doing?" The foreman turned to me, looking uncomfortable. "Ma'am, we're here to access the utility easement for some routine maintenance. This lady says she's with the town council and—" "Did she show you any official documentation?" I interrupted, "because I own this property and I haven't been notified of any scheduled maintenance." Barbara stepped forward, that familiar, smug smile playing on her lips. "As a council member, I'm simply facilitating necessary municipal work. The easement clearly states the easement requires proper notice and documentation." I cut in. "Where's your work order? Which utility company are you with?" I directed these questions to the foreman, who was starting to look increasingly uncertain. "Well, he stammered, pulling out some paperwork. "We're with Valley Construction and contracted by—" He trailed off, studying the documents more carefully. I pulled out my phone and dialed the police. "Officer Reynolds, I have a situation here involving unauthorized construction workers attempting to access my property under false pretenses." Barbara's smile faltered slightly, but she held her ground. "This is perfectly legal. The easement doesn't give you the right to authorize construction work on private property," I finished for her. "Should we call the utility companies and verify this supposed maintenance work?" The foreman was now backing away, signaling his crew. "Look, lady," he said to Barbara, "you said this was all approved. I'm not getting my company mixed up in a property dispute." As the construction crew packed up to leave, Officer Reynolds arrived with another patrol car. Barbara immediately switched to her victim role. "Thank goodness you're here, officer. The Andersons are obstructing important municipal work." Officer Reynolds looked tired. "Mrs. Wilson, we've been through this. Do you have official documentation for this work order?" Barbara fumbled in her designer handbag, pulling out some papers. "Of course, I have it right here." She produced what looked like a standard utility easement document, but as Officer Reynolds examined it, his expression hardened. "Mrs. Wilson, this is just a copy of the general easement agreement. There's no work order here, no maintenance schedule, nothing authorizing today's work." He turned to the construction foreman. "Sir, who hired your company for this job?" The foreman shifted uncomfortably. "We received a work order signed by Mrs. Wilson here. She said she was acting on behalf of the town council." Officer Reynolds pulled out his notepad. "Mrs. Wilson impersonating a municipal authority to authorize construction work is a serious offense." Barbara's composure finally cracked. "This is ridiculous. I am on the town council. That road needs to be accessible." Being on the town council doesn't give you the authority to authorize private construction work," Officer Reynolds replied. "Mrs. Anderson, would you like to press charges?" Before I could answer, Sarah Thompson's voice rang out from behind us. "I would." She walked up, holding her phone. "I've been recording everything since the construction crew arrived, and as a former municipal clerk, I can tell you exactly how many laws Mrs. Wilson just broke." Barbara's face went pale. "You can't be serious. This is just a misunderstanding." "A misunderstanding?" Sarah's voice was sharp. "Like how you misunderstood that you can't forge municipal work orders, or how you misunderstood that you can't authorize construction on private property." Officer Reynolds was now taking detailed statements from the construction crew. The foreman handed over his paperwork, including the work order Barbara had given them. Sarah examined it and let out a low whistle. "Using outdated town council letterhead, forging signatures." "Barbara, what were you thinking?" Barbara's husband, Richard, suddenly appeared, having been called by his wife. He took in the scene, the police cars, the retreating construction crew, his wife's crumbling facade, and for once he looked unsure. "Barbara," he said quietly, "what did you do?" "What did I do?" she shrieked, finally losing all composure. "I tried to protect our community from these newcomers who think they can just wall everything off. That road has been open for decades." "That road," I said firmly, "is private property. And now you've added attempted construction fraud to trespassing and harassment." Officer Reynolds finished his notes and turned to Barbara. "Mrs. Wilson, I'm going to need you to come down to the station to make a formal statement. This is, now, a criminal matter." As Officer Reynolds led Barbara to his patrol car, she turned back to me, her face contorted with rage. "This isn't over. You have no idea who you're dealing with." Richard watched helplessly as his wife was escorted away, then turned to me. "Surely we can work something out. Barbara's just passionate about community issues. Perhaps we could come to some arrangement." The time for arrangements was before your wife started forging municipal documents, Sarah interjected. "This goes way beyond neighborhood disputes now." Looking at Richard's defeated expression, I almost felt sorry for him, almost. But then I remembered the midnight harassment campaign, the vandalism, and now this attempted fraud, all because his wife couldn't accept being told no. As the police cars pulled away, James Cooper emerged from behind the half-installed gate. He had witnessed the entire scene while continuing his work. "Well," he said, checking the gate's mechanism, "I think we'd better add a few more security cameras. Something tells me this might not be Mrs. Wilson's last attempt to cause trouble." He was right. Barbara Wilson had just raised the stakes significantly, but her next move would prove that she still had a few more shocking tricks up her sleeve. The aftermath of Barbara's arrest rippled through our small community like a stone thrown into still water. Local news picked up the story, with headlines reading, "Town Council member arrested for fraudulent construction scheme." Richard Wilson hired an expensive attorney from the city, and Barbara was released on bail within hours, but the damage to her reputation was already done. That evening, as David and I sat on our porch discussing the day's events, a sleek black car pulled into our driveway. Lisa Martinez, a reporter from the local newspaper, stepped out with a notebook in hand. She'd heard about the incident and wanted our side of the story. "Mrs. Anderson," she began, settling into a porch chair, "I've been doing some digging into similar complaints about Barbara Wilson. You're not the first person she's targeted, but you're the first to stand up to her legally. Would you be willing to share your experience?" I glanced at David, who nodded encouragingly. As I recounted the events of the past weeks, Lisa's pen flew across her notepad. She seemed particularly interested in the security footage of the midnight convoy and the forged work orders. "This fits a pattern. Lisa explained, flipping through her notes. I've uncovered multiple instances of Mrs. Wilson using her council position to intimidate residents. Most people were too afraid of her influence to come forward, but now... She smiled. Well, let's just say my phone has been ringing non-stop since her arrest. Just then, Sarah Thompson hurried up our driveway, waving a stack of papers. Emily, you need to see this, she called out, slightly out of breath. I still have contacts at the municipal office, and they found something interesting. Lisa perked up, her reporter's instincts clearly sensing a story. Sarah spread the papers on our porch table. They were old council meeting minutes and property records dating back several years. Look at this, Sarah pointed to a highlighted section. 3 years ago, Barbara tried to push through a resolution to reclassify several private roads as public access ways. It failed, but she never updated the council's maps. She's been using these incorrect maps to justify her actions. Lisa was scribbling furiously. That would explain the pattern of complaints I've been receiving. Mrs. Wilson appears to have been systematically targeting private roads throughout the area. As we pored over the documents, headlights swept across the porch. A police car pulled up, and Officer Reynolds stepped out, looking grim. Mrs. Anderson, we need to talk, he said, climbing the porch steps. Mrs. Wilson has filed a counter-complaint. She's claiming you're violating historical access rights and demanding an emergency injunction to stop the gate installation. I felt my blood pressure rising. Based on what grounds? She submitted those incorrect council maps as evidence, Officer Reynolds explained. Now, I know they're not valid, but her lawyer is pushing for an emergency hearing tomorrow morning. They're trying to rush this through before you can properly respond. Lisa's eyes lit up. Officer, would you be willing to go on record about this? The public should know about these tactics. Before Officer Reynolds could respond, another car screeched into our driveway. Richard Wilson emerged, looking disheveled and angry. You're making a big mistake, he called out, striding toward the porch. Barbara's lawyer says we can sue you for defamation. All these accusations, getting the press involved. You have no idea what you're dealing with. Officer Reynolds stepped between Richard and the porch. Mr. Wilson, I suggest you leave before this situation escalates further. Richard jabbed a finger in my direction. This isn't over. Barbara has friends in high places. One phone call, and your photography business will be finished. How many clients do you think you'll keep once word gets out about your difficulties with the community? Are you threatening Mrs. Anderson? Lisa asked sharply, her pen poised. Would you like to rephrase that for the record? Richard's face reddened as he realized a reporter was present. He backpedaled quickly, retreating to his car. As he drove away, Sarah pulled out her phone, playing a recording of his entire tirade. Add witness intimidation to the list, she said grimly. I started recording the moment I saw his car turn in. Officer Reynolds shook his head. The Wilsons are digging themselves deeper with every move. Mrs. Anderson, I'd recommend getting a lawyer before tomorrow's hearing. This is escalating beyond simple trespassing. Lisa closed her notebook with a satisfied snap. I'd say it's escalating into one of the biggest stories this town has seen in years. Mind if I stick around for a while? Something tells me there's more to come. She wasn't wrong. As we sat there discussing strategy for the hearing, my phone buzzed with a text from James Cooper. The security cameras had caught something disturbing at the gate construction site. Barbara Wilson had just shown up with a group of people carrying signs, and they were setting up what looked like a protest camp. They can't do that, Officer Reynolds said, watching the live feed on my phone. That's still private property. I think that's the point, Lisa mused. They're trying to force a confrontation before the hearing, classic pressure tactic. Sarah studied the footage more closely. Wait a minute. I recognize those people. They're not even from our neighborhood. Barbara's bringing in outside protesters. As if on cue, we could hear chanting in the distance. The protesters were getting louder, their voices carrying across the property. Public roads for public. Good. Stop the private property feud. Officer Reynolds stood up, straightening his uniform. I'll handle the protesters. Mrs. Anderson, you focus on preparing for tomorrow's hearing. This needs to end legally, not through escalation. As he drove toward the gate, Lisa turned to me with a determined expression. Would you be willing to let me stay and document this? The public needs to see how far Barbara Wilson is willing to go to maintain her illusion of control. Looking at the growing protest on my security feed, I nodded. Barbara wanted to play hardball. Fine. But this time, everything she did would be on record, and her tactics wouldn't stay in the shadows any longer. What happened next would make Barbara's previous actions look tame in comparison, as she unleashed a plan that would shock even her closest allies and force me to make a decision that would change our community forever. The emergency hearing was scheduled for 8 in the morning at the county courthouse. I arrived early with Rachel Green, a property rights attorney Sarah Thompson had recommended. The marble hallway echoed with our footsteps as we made our way to the designated courtroom. Barbara and Richard Wilson were already there with their lawyer, a sharp-dressed man who looked like he charged more per hour than most people made in a week. Barbara wore a conservative blue suit and had styled her hair to look softer, more approachable, clearly trying to present herself as a concerned community leader rather than the antagonist she truly was. Judge Patricia Coleman entered the courtroom, her expression neutral as she reviewed the emergency filing. Barbara's lawyer jumped up immediately, launching into a well-rehearsed speech about historical community access and the vital importance of maintaining established traffic patterns. Your Honor, he said smoothly, Mrs. Wilson has served this community for years. She's simply trying to protect the public's right to use a road that has been open to all for decades. The Andersons' attempt to restrict access represents a clear danger to community welfare. Rachel Green stood next, her voice calm but firm. Your Honor, opposing counsel is attempting to create an emergency where none exists. This is a private road on private property, as clearly established by county records. Mrs. Wilson's claim of historical access is based on outdated and incorrect maps that were never officially adopted by the town council. Judge Coleman turned to Barbara's lawyer. Do you have documentation showing this road was ever officially designated for public use? We have testimony from numerous residents about its long-term public use, he replied, somewhat evasively. That's not what I asked, Judge Coleman said sharply. Do you have legal documentation showing this is a public road? Real. As Barbara's lawyer fumbled through his papers, Rachel produced our property surveys and deed records. Your Honor, I have the complete chain of title showing this has always been a private road. Additionally, I have evidence that Mrs. Wilson knowingly used incorrect maps to justify her actions, including attempting to authorize fraudulent construction work on private property. The judge studied the documents carefully. Mrs. Wilson, please approach the bench. Barbara stepped forward, maintaining her carefully crafted, concerned citizen demeanor. Judge Coleman looked at her over her reading glasses. Mrs. Wilson, are you aware that knowingly presenting incorrect municipal maps as evidence constitutes fraud upon the court? Barbara's composure cracked slightly. Your Honor, those maps were part of a proposed resolution. A resolution that failed. Judge Coleman interrupted. Yet you continued to represent these roads as public access ways. Can you explain why? Before Barbara could respond, the courtroom doors burst open. Lisa Martinez hurried in, followed by several other people I recognized from the neighborhood. Your Honor, Lisa called out, I have relevant evidence that needs to be presented. Judge Coleman frowned at the interruption, but Lisa pressed on. I'm a reporter with the local paper, and I've uncovered a pattern of similar actions by Mrs. Wilson. These citizens have signed affidavits detailing how she used her council position to intimidate them over private property disputes. Barbara's lawyer jumped up. Objection, this is irrelevant to the emergency motion. On the contrary, Rachel countered, it shows a pattern of behavior directly relevant to Mrs. Wilson's credibility and true motivations in this case. Judge Coleman studied the new affidavits, her expression growing sterner with each page. Mrs. Wilson, this is very troubling. Not only have you presented false evidence, but there appears to be a pattern of using your counsel position to harass property owners. Barbara's carefully constructed facade finally shattered. Those people should have worked with me, she burst out. I'm trying to protect our community from selfish individuals who want to block access to traditional shortcuts. Traditional shortcuts across private property are still trespassing, Judge Coleman stated firmly. Mrs. Wilson, I'm denying your emergency motion. Furthermore, I'm referring this matter to the District Attorney's Office for investigation of possible criminal charges related to fraud and abuse of office. As Barbara slumped in her chair, her lawyer quickly gathered his papers. Your Honor, we request a brief recess to consider our options. Granted, Judge Coleman replied. But let me be clear, any further attempts to interfere with the Andersons' private property rights will result in serious consequences. In the hallway after the hearing, Lisa was already typing rapidly on her phone, no doubt preparing her next article. Sarah Thompson, who had slipped into the courtroom during the proceedings, approached with a grim smile. It's not over, she warned quietly. Barbara won't let this go. She's invested too much of her reputation in maintaining control over the neighborhood. Right on cue, my phone buzzed with an alert from the security cameras. The protesters at our gate had been joined by news vans, not just from Lisa's paper, but from regional television stations as well. She's called in the media, Rachel observed, watching the feed over my shoulder. She's going to try to turn this into a public opinion battle. Richard Wilson approached us, his expression thunderous. You've made a powerful enemy, he growled. Barbara's already talking to state representatives about eminent domain proceedings. One way or another, that road will be opened. Rachel stepped forward. Mr. Wilson, are you attempting to threaten my client again? Because I'd be happy to add witness intimidation to the growing list of charges. Richard backed away, but his threat lingered in the air. As we walked out of the courthouse, we could see Barbara giving interviews on the steps, tears streaming down her face as she talked about community destruction and the death of neighborhood traditions. She's good, Lisa admitted, watching the performance. But she's playing a dangerous game. The more attention she draws to this, the more likely her other victims are to come forward. Back at home, the protest had grown larger. Someone had set up a tent and was passing out flyers filled with misleading information about property rights and community access. Officer Reynolds and several other police officers were keeping the protesters off the private road. But the situation felt like a powder keg ready to explode. James Cooper arrived to continue work on the gates, having to squeeze his truck through a gauntlet of angry protesters. We need to finish this installation fast, he said, eyeing the crowd warily. The longer this drags on, the more dangerous it becomes. As I watched the circus unfolding at my front gate, I realized Barbara had just made her biggest mistake yet. By drawing media attention to her crusade, she'd unknowingly opened the door for every person she'd ever bullied to step forward. The question was, how many skeletons would come tumbling out of her closet, and how far would she go to try to keep them buried? The answer would come sooner than anyone expected, and it would change our quiet suburban community forever. Midway through the gate installation, an unmarked envelope appeared in our mailbox. Inside was a stack of documents that made my hands shake as I read through them. They were internal town council emails spanning back several years, showing a pattern of corruption that went far beyond simple road access disputes. I immediately called Lisa Martinez, who arrived within minutes, her reporter's notebook already in hand. As we spread the documents across my kitchen table, Sarah Thompson joined us, her municipal experience proving invaluable in decoding the bureaucratic language. Look at these timestamps. Sarah pointed to a series of emails. Barbara wasn't just targeting private roads, she was coordinating with local developers. Every time someone refused to let her use their private road, as a shortcut, mysterious zoning changes would appear, making their property less valuable. Lisa's pen flew across her notepad, and these developers would then swoop in with lowball offers to buy the devalued properties. Once the sales went through, the zoning would mysteriously revert back. A message from James Cooper interrupted our investigation. The security cameras had caught something unusual. Barbara Wilson engaging in an intense argument with someone in an expensive-looking car near our gate. The man's face wasn't visible, but his license plate was clear in the footage. Lisa made a quick phone call. That plate belongs to Marcus Sterling, she reported, hanging up. He's one of the biggest developers in the county, and according to these emails, he's been working with Barbara for years. Sarah's face paled as she connected the dots. The road access complaints weren't about shortcuts at all. They were about identifying properties for potential development. Barbara would harass homeowners until they got fed up and sold. Then Sterling's company would buy the land at below market rates. My phone buzzed with a text from David. He'd received a strange call at work from someone claiming to represent a major real estate investment firm, offering to buy our property for twice its market value. The catch, we had to decide within 24 hours. It's their standard playbook, Sarah explained, digging through more emails. First harassment, then if that doesn't work, they try to buy you out quickly before you discover what your property is really worth. A knock at the door made us all jump. Officer Reynolds stood on the porch, looking troubled. Mrs. Anderson, we've got a situation. Someone just filed complaints against your photography business. Zoning violations, operating without proper permits, the works. They're trying to shut you down. Lisa was already typing on her laptop. Classic intimidation tactic. There are 3 other cases in these emails where Barbara used false complaints to pressure business owners who opposed her plans. Another security alert popped up on my phone. The protesters at the gate were being handed new signs, these ones attacking my photography business directly. Sexual content in a residential area. One sign read, twisting my boudoir photography services into something sinister. Protect our children, declared another. They're trying to turn the community against you, Sarah observed grimly. Make you look like the villain so no one questions when your business gets shut down. Officer Reynolds studied the protest footage. Those aren't local people anymore. They're paid protesters. I've seen them at other developer disputes. Sterling's company uses them to create artificial community outrage. As if to confirm his words, a new email arrived from an anonymous address. It contained a single image, a professional rendering of a massive apartment complex superimposed over what was clearly our property. The message was clear: sell now or face endless harassment. Lisa's eyes narrowed as she examined the rendering. This development plan is dated 6 months ago, before you even bought the property. They'd been planning this all along. The road access dispute was just a smokescreen. Sarah was already pulling up more documents on her tablet. The town's master plan doesn't allow for this kind of development here, unless... She paused, scrolling rapidly. Unless someone on the council pushed through a quiet rezoning amendment, which Barbara did 3 weeks ago. A commotion outside drew us to the window. Richard Wilson had arrived at the protest, handing out what looked like flyers. Through the security camera feed, we could see they contained personal information about me and David, where we worked, our previous addresses, even photos of our house. "That's crossing a line," Officer Reynolds said, reaching for his radio. "Distributing personal information with intent to harass is illegal." Before he could call for backup, a sleek town car pulled up to the protest. Marcus Sterling himself stepped out, heading straight for Richard. Their conversation was tense, with Sterling repeatedly pointing at the cameras and shaking his head. "He's worried about exposure," Lisa observed. "Sterling's company is publicly traded. If their strong-arm tactics become public knowledge." As if on cue, my phone rang. It was an unlisted number. "Mrs. Anderson," a smooth voice said when I answered. "This is Marcus Sterling. I think we need to have a conversation about mutual benefit and community development." I put the phone on speaker. "You mean you want to talk about how you and Barbara Wilson have been manipulating property values for your development schemes?" There was a long pause. "Those are serious allegations. Perhaps we could discuss this privately? I'm sure we can find a resolution that benefits everyone." "You mean like the resolutions you found with other property owners?" Lisa cut in. "The ones Barbara harassed until they sold to you at a loss." "Who is this?" Sterling demanded, his smooth tone cracking. "Lisa Martinez, local press. Would you care to comment on your company's use of paid protesters and fraudulent zoning complaints to pressure property owners?" The line went dead. Through the security feed, we watched Sterling rush back to his car, barking orders at Richard Wilson as he left. The paid protesters began to disperse, leaving only a few confused local residents behind. "They're running, scared," Sarah said with grim satisfaction. "But that makes them dangerous. People like Sterling and Barbara won't go down without a fight." Officer Reynolds nodded in agreement. "You should be prepared for things to get worse before they get better. Once people like this feel cornered." He didn't need to finish the sentence. We all knew that Barbara and her developer friends wouldn't simply walk away from their schemes. The question was, what would they try next, and how far would they go to protect their corrupt enterprise? The answer would come that very night, in a way that none of us could have anticipated, and it would force me to make a decision that would either end this fight once and for all, or lose everything I'd been fighting to protect. The night brought an eerie silence to our property. The protesters had dispersed hours ago, leaving only scattered signs and empty coffee cups as evidence of their presence. James Cooper and his team worked late into the evening, determined to complete the gate installation before leaving. The security lights cast long shadows across the driveway as they packed up their tools. Just before midnight, my phone lit up with a notification. The motion sensors had detected movement at the edge of our property. On the security feed, I watched several dark figures moving through the trees, keeping to the shadows. They carried what looked like heavy equipment. I immediately dialed Officer Reynolds, but before I could speak, all our exterior lights went dark. Someone had cut the power. The security camera feed switched to backup batteries, showing more figures emerging from the tree line. In the dim moonlight, I could make out Barbara Wilson's distinctive silhouette, directing the others like a conductor leading an orchestra. David grabbed our emergency flashlights while I tried calling Officer Reynolds again. This time he answered, his voice tense. "Mrs. Anderson, we're already en route. Multiple silent alarms were triggered in your area. Stay inside and keep your doors locked." Through the security feed, we watched the group approach our newly installed gates. 2 men carried what appeared to be industrial cutting equipment. Barbara stood back, speaking into a phone, while Richard Wilson supervised the operation. They clearly hadn't noticed the cameras were still running on backup power. Sarah. Thompson's car pulled up quietly at the end of our driveway, her headlights off. She must have seen the power cut from her house. Lisa Martinez slipped out of the passenger seat, her phone held high to record everything. They stayed hidden in the shadows, documenting the scene. Suddenly, a familiar luxury car appeared. Marcus Sterling had arrived. He rushed toward Barbara, gesturing angrily. Their voices carried faintly through the night air, picked up by the security system's microphones. "This is not what we discussed," Sterling hissed. "Breaking and entering, destruction of property. Are you trying to ruin everything?" Barbara's reply was equally heated. "You said handle it. Well, I'm handling it. Once the gates are gone and we have access, they'll have no choice but to sell. No one wants to live in a war zone." "By committing felonies on camera?" Sterling's voice rose in frustration. "Did you really think they wouldn't have backup power? Security systems? This isn't 20 years ago, Barbara. You can't just bully people into submission anymore." Their argument was interrupted by the distant sound of sirens. The men with the cutting equipment froze, looking to Barbara for direction. Richard Wilson started herding people back toward their vehicles, but Barbara stood her ground. "Let them come," she declared, her voice carrying across the property. "I've invested too much in this community to let some outsiders ruin everything. This road belongs to all of us." Sterling grabbed her arm. "This road belongs to them, and you know it. You've gone too far this time. I'm not going down for your vendetta." As he turned to leave, Barbara called after him. "You're just as involved as I am. All those property deals, the zoning changes, the fake complaints. Your company benefited from everything." Sterling froze. Lisa Martinez stepped out of the shadows, her phone still recording. "Would you care to elaborate on that, Mrs. Wilson? Perhaps explain exactly how Mr. Sterling's company benefited from your actions as a council member?" The look of horror on Sterling's face was almost comical. Barbara whirled around, finally noticing Lisa and Sarah documenting everything. The approaching sirens grew louder. "You set me up!" Barbara screamed at Sterling. "You knew they were recording." "You set yourself up," Sterling shot back, "and you just implicated my entire company on camera. My lawyers will bury you for this." Officer Reynolds' voice boomed through a megaphone. "This is the police. You are all trespassing on private property. Put down any tools and equipment and place your hands where we can see them." The hired men dropped their equipment immediately, raising their hands. Richard Wilson tried to run, but tripped over the abandoned cutting tools. Sterling stood perfectly still, his legal training apparently kicking in. But Barbara Wilson made one final desperate move. She sprinted toward the gate control panel, pulling something from her pocket. In the camera feed, I could see it was a small canister, pepper spray. She began dousing the control panel's electronics. "If I can't use this road," she shouted, "no one will." The electrical system sparked dangerously. James Cooper had thankfully installed surge protectors and emergency shutoffs, but Barbara's actions could have caused serious damage, or worse, injured someone. Officer Reynolds and his team moved in quickly, subduing Barbara as she continued to scream about community rights and tradition. Sterling was already on his phone, presumably with his lawyers. Richard Wilson sat on the ground, head in his hands, as officers collected everyone's information. Lisa Martinez was in her element, documenting everything while Sarah Thompson provided running commentary about municipal regulations and criminal statutes. Their presence had turned what might have been a simple trespassing case into documented evidence of a larger criminal conspiracy. Inside our home, David and I watched the scene unfold on our security feeds. The power returned, flooding the property with light and revealing the full extent of what had nearly happened. The cutting equipment abandoned by the gate was industrial, grade. They hadn't just planned to break the gate, they'd meant to destroy it completely. Officer Reynolds approached our front door once the scene was secured. "Mrs. Anderson," he said gravely, "we're going to need copies of all your security footage. This just went from a simple property dispute to a criminal conspiracy case. The district attorney is already en route." As emergency vehicles' lights flashed across our property, I couldn't help but wonder how Barbara's obsession with controlling our private road had led to this moment. But what none of us realized then was that this night would uncover something far bigger than a simple case of trespassing or vandalism. Barbara's desperate actions had unknowingly pulled a thread that would unravel decades of corruption in our small community. The question was, who else would be exposed when the full truth came to light? Morning arrived with a flurry of activity at the county courthouse. District Attorney Michael Chen had called an emergency press conference to address the previous night's events. Television crews set up their equipment as reporters gathered. Lisa Martinez positioned front and center, her earlier footage already making waves on local news. Rachel Green met me at the courthouse steps, carrying a thick folder of documents. "The DA's office worked through the night," she explained as we hurried inside. Once they started digging into Barbara's records, everything started unraveling. Sterling's company is already trying to distance themselves, offering to cooperate in exchange for leniency. The main courtroom was packed. Barbara and Richard Wilson sat with their lawyer, both looking disheveled after a night in custody. Marcus Sterling occupied a seat near the back, surrounded by a team of corporate attorneys. The tension in the room was palpable. District Attorney Chen approached the podium, his expression grave. "Last night's events have uncovered what appears to be a years-long pattern of corruption and abuse of power. We have evidence of systematic harassment, fraudulent property schemes, and misuse of public office for private gain." He held up a stack of papers. "These documents, obtained through our investigation, show a coordinated effort between Council Member Wilson and Sterling Development to manipulate property values through targeted harassment and fraudulent zoning changes. The scope of this scheme is staggering." Barbara's lawyer jumped to his feet. "Your Honor, my client maintains her innocence. Any actions taken were in the interest of preserving community access to traditional routes." DA Chen's response was swift. "We have video evidence of your client attempting to destroy private property while explicitly discussing criminal conspiracy with Mr. Sterling. Furthermore, our investigation has revealed numerous instances of similar behavior targeting other property owners." As if on cue, the courtroom doors opened. A group of people entered, former residents who had sold their properties under suspicious circumstances. Sarah Thompson had helped track them down overnight, using her knowledge of municipal records to identify patterns in property sales. Mark Johnson, a former resident who had sold his home to Sterling's company 2 years ago, stepped forward to testify. "Barbara Wilson made my life hell," he stated firmly. "She organized protests outside my house, filed false complaints about my home business, and had people trespassing on my property day and night. When Sterling's company offered to buy my house, it felt like my only escape." One by one, similar stories emerged. A pattern became clear. Barbara would target properties that Sterling's company wanted to acquire, using her position on the town council to make owners' lives miserable until they sold at below-market rates. Marcus Sterling shifted uncomfortably in his seat as more evidence was presented. His lawyers huddled around him, whispering urgently. Finally, one of them stood up. "Your Honor, our client wishes to cooperate fully with the investigation. Mr. Sterling has evidence of additional misconduct involving other council members and development projects." The revelation sent whispers rippling through the courtroom. Barbara Wilson's face turned ashen as her former ally prepared to turn against her. Richard Wilson slumped in his chair, the full weight of their situation finally seeming to hit him. DA Chen accepted Sterling's offer of cooperation, but made it clear there would be no full immunity. "Mr. Sterling's cooperation will be taken into consideration, but his company's involvement in these schemes cannot be overlooked." As the hearing progressed, Lisa Martinez quietly showed me her laptop screen. She had been doing real-time research as new names came up in testimony. The corruption web stretched far beyond our small community. Similar patterns of harassment and property manipulation appeared in neighboring towns, always involving Sterling Development and local officials. Rachel Green passed me a note. The FBI had just arrived at the courthouse, interested in possible wire fraud and racketeering charges due to the multi-jurisdiction nature of the scheme. This had grown far beyond a simple dispute over a private road. During a brief recess, Officer Reynolds approached with news from the crime scene team. The cutting equipment they brought last night? It was reported stolen from a construction site 3 months ago. We've got Barbara and Richard's fingerprints all over it. Sarah Thompson joined us, her tablet displaying property records. I've been mapping out all the properties Sterling's company acquired over the past 5 years. Every single one had complaints filed against them by Barbara, and everyone was rezoned just before the sale. The implications were staggering. Barbara's obsession with controlling private roads wasn't just about shortcuts or community access. It was part of a larger strategy to identify and target properties for acquisition. My refusal to let her use our road had inadvertently exposed a criminal enterprise that had been operating for years. When court resumed, Barbara Wilson finally seemed to grasp the severity of her situation. Her carefully crafted image of a concerned community leader had crumbled, replaced by the reality of a corrupt official who had abused her position for personal gain. Judge Coleman addressed the court. Based on the evidence presented, I am ordering all defendants to remain in custody, pending full investigation. Furthermore, I'm issuing an emergency injunction freezing all assets related to these property transactions. As Barbara was led away in handcuffs, she turned to glare at me one final time. But the intimidating power she once held was gone, replaced by the desperate look of someone watching their world collapse. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed, hungry for details about the growing scandal. Lisa Martinez's initial story had gone viral, drawing attention from national news outlets. The FBI's involvement had transformed a local corruption case into a major investigation of real estate fraud. Rachel Green pulled me aside as we left the courthouse. "This isn't over," she warned. "There will be more revelations, more people involved." Barbara Wilson was just the visible part of a much larger problem. Looking at the media circus surrounding the courthouse, I realized she was right. What had started as a simple defense of property rights had unveiled a deep-rooted system of corruption. The question now was, how many more dominoes would fall as the investigation continued? The answer would shake our community to its core, revealing that Barbara's criminal enterprise was merely the tip of an iceberg that went deeper than anyone could have imagined. Federal agents swarmed Sterling Development's offices at dawn, carrying boxes of files and hard drives. The investigation had expanded rapidly, with Marcus Sterling's cooperation opening floodgates of information about corruption across multiple jurisdictions. Inside the building, a team of forensic accountants worked methodically through years of financial records, uncovering a complex web of bribes, kickbacks, and fraudulent property deals. Lisa Martinez called me early that morning, her voice excited. "You need to see this," she said. "I'm sending you some documents that just got leaked from the investigation. It's bigger than we thought." The files she sent revealed a sophisticated network of shell companies, all connected to Sterling Development and various local officials. Barbara Wilson's harassment campaigns weren't random. They were carefully orchestrated to drive down property values in areas targeted for development. Sarah Thompson arrived at my house with fresh coffee and her own stack of documents. "The FBI found a hidden server in Sterling's office," she explained, spreading papers across my kitchen table. It contained databases of potential targets, private roads, isolated properties, anything that could be vulnerable to their pressure tactics. My own property appeared in their files, marked as a priority acquisition months before we even bought it. The previous owners had been on their target list too, but had moved before Barbara could implement her usual harassment strategy. David studied the documents, his IT background helping him decode the technical details. "Look at these email timestamps," he pointed out. They were monitoring real estate listings, targeting properties before they even went on market. Barbara's road access demands were just the first step in their playbook. Officer Reynolds stopped by later that morning, looking exhausted but determined. "We've been interviewing former council members all night," he reported. "Once they realized Sterling was talking, everyone started coming forward. The corruption goes back at least a decade. The scope of the conspiracy was staggering. Sterling Development had been using local officials like Barbara to identify and acquire properties across multiple counties. The officials would create problems for targeted homeowners, bogus citations, zoning changes, harassment campaigns, while Sterling's shell companies waited to swoop in with lowball offers. Rachel Green arrived with updates from the federal investigation. "They're treating this as a RICO case now," she explained. "Racketeering, corruption, wire fraud. The whole operation was run like an organized crime enterprise." My phone buzzed with a text from James Cooper. He'd finished installing additional security measures around our property, anticipating potential retaliation from others implicated in the investigation. "Stay alert," he warned. "People with everything. To lose can be dangerous." Late afternoon brought another surprise. A group of residents from a neighboring town arrived at our gate, led by their former mayor. They had their own stories of Barbara Wilson's involvement in suspicious property deals in their community. Sterling Development had built a controversial shopping center there after a series of suspicious property acquisitions remarkably similar to what we'd experienced. Lisa Martinez interviewed them on the spot, her article about the expanding investigation already trending online. "The FBI is calling this one of the largest real estate fraud schemes they've uncovered in the state," she revealed. Barbara's arrest was just the beginning. Inside the county jail, Barbara Wilson was finally beginning to crack. Her lawyer had arranged a deal with federal prosecutors in exchange for her full cooperation. She spent hours detailing how the scheme worked, how she would identify potential targets, how Sterling's company would create shell corporations to hide their involvement, how other officials were paid off to look the other way. Richard Wilson, facing his own criminal charges, turned against his wife. He revealed how Barbara had maintained detailed records of their operations, including recordings of conversations with other corrupt officials. Those recordings were now in the hands of federal investigators. Sarah Thompson's phone lit up with notifications from her contacts in neighboring municipalities. Similar investigations were being launched in other communities where Sterling Development had projects. The pattern was always the same: harassment, fraudulent complaints, manipulation of local regulations, followed by property acquisitions at deflated prices. As evening approached, Rachel Green called with another update. The FBI had frozen dozens of bank accounts connected to the scheme. Sterling Development stock had been suspended from trading. Marcus Sterling himself was now under house arrest, his cooperation deal contingent on his ability to help unravel the entire network. District Attorney Chen held another press conference, outlining the expanding scope of the investigation. What began as a simple property dispute has exposed a criminal enterprise that operated with impunity for years, he announced. "We're seeing evidence of systematic corruption that affected hundreds of property owners across multiple jurisdictions." From my home office, I watched the press conference while reviewing more documents with Sarah and Lisa. The security cameras showed news vans still parked near our gate, hoping to catch a glimpse of the property that had sparked the investigation that brought down Barbara Wilson's criminal empire. My phone rang again. This time it was a producer from a national news program wanting to schedule an interview about how my stand against Barbara's trespassing had exposed the larger conspiracy. I politely declined, preferring to let Lisa handle the media coverage. She had been there from the beginning, documenting everything. Officer Reynolds stopped by one final time that evening with an unexpected piece of news. The investigation had uncovered evidence that Barbara and Sterling's operation wasn't unique. Similar schemes were being uncovered in other states, leading to a broader federal investigation of real estate fraud and corruption nationwide. As night fell, I stood at my window, looking out at the now completed electric gates that had started. It all, what began as a simple desire to protect our private property, had unleashed a cascade of revelations that would reshape our entire community. But even as Barbara Wilson's corruption was exposed, there were still unanswered questions about who else might have been involved and how deep the conspiracy truly went. The next few days would bring even more shocking revelations as the full extent of the corruption finally came to light. The federal courthouse buzzed with anticipation as Barbara Wilson's plea hearing approached. Journalists packed the gallery, their cameras trained on the entrance where the disgraced council member would soon appear. Marcus Sterling had already pleaded guilty to multiple federal charges, his testimony laying bare the extent of their criminal enterprise. Lisa Martinez sat beside me, her laptop open as she prepared to document this final chapter. The evidence uncovered in the past week had transformed our local scandal into a landmark case of real estate fraud and public corruption. Sterling Development's scheme had affected thousands of property owners across 5 states. Sarah Thompson arrived with fresh documents from her municipal contacts. "The state attorney general just announced a task force," she whispered, sliding into the row behind us. "They're reviewing every major development project from the last decade. The governor's involved now." Barbara entered the courtroom in handcuffs, her designer outfit replaced by prison orange. Gone was the imperious demeanor she had wielded like a weapon. In its place was a defeated woman who had watched her carefully constructed world crumble. The proceedings moved quickly. Barbara had agreed to plead guilty to multiple felony counts, including racketeering, wire fraud, and abuse of public office. In exchange for her cooperation, prosecutors would recommend a reduced sentence, though she still faced significant prison time. As the judge read the charges, I thought about how this all started with a simple property dispute. Barbara's obsession with controlling our private road had been the loose thread that, when pulled, unraveled an entire criminal enterprise. District Attorney Chen presented the plea agreement, detailing Barbara's cooperation. She had provided investigators with recordings, documents, and testimony implicating dozens of other officials and developers. Her meticulous record-keeping, once used to track their targets, now served as evidence of their crimes. During her allocution, Barbara finally revealed the true scope of their operation. Sterling Development hadn't just manipulated property, values. They had corrupted entire local governments. Planning boards were bribed, inspectors were paid off, and officials like Barbara were rewarded for targeting resistant property owners. Richard Wilson watched from the gallery as his wife detailed their crimes. He had accepted his own plea deal earlier that week, trading information for leniency. Their marriage, like their criminal enterprise, had collapsed under the weight of mutual betrayal. Outside the courthouse, Rachel Green updated me on the civil cases being prepared. A class action lawsuit had been filed on behalf of property owners affected by the scheme. Sterling Development's insurance carriers had already initiated settlement discussions, recognizing the overwhelming evidence of fraud. Officer Reynolds joined us, sharing news from the ongoing investigation. "We've identified similar operations in other states," he explained. The FBI is calling it a blueprint for real estate fraud. Barbara and Sterling's methods were copied by developers across the country. The impact on our community was profound. The town council had been dissolved, replaced by state-appointed administrators until special elections could be held. Every development project approved during Barbara's tenure was under review, with many facing legal challenges from property owners who had been pressured to sell. James Cooper arrived with updates about our property security. Other victims of the scheme had hired him to install similar protective measures, turning their homes into fortresses against harassment and intimidation. My electric gates had become a symbol of resistance against corruption. Sarah's tablet chimed with breaking news. The state legislature had fast-tracked new laws, strengthening property rights and increasing penalties for official corruption. Our case had exposed weaknesses in existing regulations that allowed schemes like Barbara's to flourish. Lisa's coverage of the scandal had earned national attention. Major news networks were preparing investigative reports, using our community as a case study in how seemingly minor property disputes could expose systemic corruption. She had already received offers to turn her articles into a book. Back at home that evening, I reviewed the security footage that had started it all. Barbara's midnight trespassing, her harassment campaigns, the attempted destruction of our gates, each incident now viewed through the lens of a larger criminal conspiracy. What I had thought was mere entitlement was actually part of a calculated scheme to pressure property owners into selling. David brought in a stack of letters from other property owners across the country, sharing similar stories of harassment and manipulation. Our stand against Barbara had given them courage to come forward, leading to investigations in their own communities. A network of mutual support had formed, with property owners helping each other resist developer pressure tactics. Rachel called with news about Sterling Development's assets. Federal authorities had seized properties worth millions, including luxury homes and vehicles purchased with proceeds from their fraudulent schemes. A restitution fund was being established to compensate victims of their property manipulation. Sarah Thompson dropped by with dinner, sharing updates from her municipal contacts. The corruption had spread beyond real estate. Investigators had uncovered evidence of kickbacks in government contracts, rigged bids on public projects, and systematic abuse of zoning regulations. The ripple effects continued to spread. Property values in areas targeted by Sterling Development were being reassessed. Banks were reviewing loans made on fraudulently acquired properties. Insurance companies were investigating claims related to the scheme. The financial impact alone would be felt for years. As night fell, I stood by our electric gates, now a testament to the importance of standing firm against corruption. What had begun as a simple measure to protect our private road had exposed a criminal enterprise that had operated unchecked for years. Barbara's insistence on using our road as her personal shortcut had led to her own downfall. The next morning would bring the final chapter in this saga as federal prosecutors prepared to reveal the full extent of their findings. The question wasn't just how many more people would be implicated, but how our community would rebuild from the ashes of this scandal. The answer would reshape not just our neighborhood, but potentially communities across the nation. 6 months after Barbara Wilson's guilty plea, our community gathered for the dedication of a new public park built on land reclaimed from Sterling Development. The property, once slated for another controversial development project, had been returned to the community as part of the settlement agreement. The ceremony marked more than just the opening of a park. It symbolized our neighborhood's recovery from years of corruption. Lisa Martinez covered the event for the national press, her investigative series on real estate fraud having earned her a Pulitzer nomination. The story she uncovered in our community had sparked similar investigations nationwide, leading to reforms in property laws and stricter oversight of development projects. Sarah Thompson stood at the podium, now serving as our newly elected town council president. Her municipal experience and role in exposing the corruption had made her the natural choice to lead the community's reformation. Under her leadership, the council had implemented unprecedented transparency measures and strict ethical guidelines. Rachel Green joined me at the ceremony, sharing updates on the civil cases. The class action lawsuit against Sterling Development had settled for hundreds of millions of dollars. Property owners who had been forced to sell under Barbara's harassment campaigns were receiving compensation and, in some cases, the opportunity to repurchase their homes at the original sales price. James Cooper's security company had expanded, specializing in protecting property owners from harassment and intimidation. The electric gates that had sparked Barbara's rage now served as a model for responsible property protection. He developed new systems incorporating lessons learned from our case, helping others defend their rights without escalating conflicts. Officer Reynolds, recently promoted to Chief of Police, implemented new training programs focused on recognizing and responding to property rights violations. His department's handling of our case had become a model for law enforcement agencies dealing with similar corruption schemes. David had leveraged his IT expertise to create a database tracking suspicious property transactions, helping investigators identify patterns of harassment and fraud. The system was being adopted by law enforcement agencies across the country, making it harder for schemes like Barbara's to take root. The federal investigation had expanded to 12 states, uncovering similar corruption networks. Marcus Sterling's cooperation had provided investigators with a blueprint of how developers manipulated local officials and pressured property owners. His testimony led to indictments of dozens of corrupt officials and real estate executives. Barbara Wilson watched these developments from her prison cell, her 15-year sentence a constant reminder of how her obsession with controlling our private road had led to her downfall. Richard Wilson, serving a shorter sentence due to his cooperation, had filed for divorce. Their carefully constructed facade of community leadership had crumbled completely. My photography business thrived, ironically benefiting from the publicity surrounding the case. Clients appreciated the story of standing up against corruption, and the electric gates that had caused so much controversy now provided a sense of security for photo sessions. The private road that Barbara had so desperately wanted to control served its intended purpose, offering peace and privacy. The wider impact of our case continued to unfold. State legislatures across the country passed Property Rights Protection Acts, strengthening safeguards against harassment and abuse of municipal power. Real estate developers faced new transparency requirements and stricter oversight of their activities. The days of using local officials to pressure property owners were ending. Our neighborhood transformed as well. The culture of fear and intimidation that Barbara had cultivated was replaced by genuine community cooperation. Neighbors who had once stayed silent out of fear now spoke openly at council meetings. The transparent processes implemented by Sarah ensured that everyone's voice could be heard without fear of retaliation. The story attracted academic interest, with law schools using our case to study the intersection of property rights and public corruption. Urban planning programs incorporated lessons learned from Sterling Development schemes into their ethics curricula. Our experience became a cautionary tale about the importance of vigilance against abuse of power. Lisa's book about the case, Private Roads, Public Corruption, became a bestseller, drawing attention to similar situations nationwide. She received messages from property owners across the country, sharing their own stories of resistance against corrupt officials and developers. A movement had begun, empowering others to stand up for their rights. The federal task force continued its work, using evidence from our case to unravel similar schemes across the country. The pattern Barbara and Sterling had established: harassment, false complaints, manipulated zoning, and predatory acquisitions, helped investigators identify corrupt networks in other communities. As I stood by our electric gates, now a symbol of righteous resistance rather than conflict, I reflected on how a simple assertion of property rights had exposed decades of corruption. The gates that Barbara had tried so desperately to destroy now stood as a testament to the importance of standing firm against intimidation and abuse of power. Sarah Thompson often reminded us that the true victory wasn't just in exposing the corruption, but in how our community responded to it. Instead of letting the scandal tear us apart, we had used it as an opportunity to rebuild stronger, with transparency and genuine cooperation, replacing the facade of community spirit that Barbara had used to mask her crimes. The final chapter of this story wasn't just about electric gates, private roads, or even corrupt officials. It was about how ordinary people standing firm in defense of their rights could spark changes that rippled far beyond their own community. Our experience had shown that sometimes the smallest acts of resistance could expose the largest systems of corruption. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.